Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Rural Community Action Assembly on Community Foundations, CDFIs, and Regional Revitalization. My name is Nathaniel Borick, and I am an Outreach and Administrative Associate with the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia in the Community Development and Regional Outreach Department. Thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to say a special thanks to our panelists, our speakers, and our partners, Penn State's Center for Economic and Community Development and the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. On the next slide. Without these partners, we really wouldn't be able to bring this excellent content, this great group of speakers, and this great networking opportunity here for you all today. So we really appreciate our partners. Our agenda for today will include we'll kick off with opening remarks, which will be followed by a panel, a 5-minute break, breakout group sessions, a report back to the full assembly, and then finally, we'll have an optional networking lunch. In the chat, you will find a link to the slides, as well as, on the next slide, please. We'll have a link to today's slides. One more slide forward. Thank you. We'll have a link to today's slides in the chat, and that those will include an agenda as well as bios for all of our speakers today. As a disclaimer, today's assembly is being recorded, except for the breakout sessions. Additionally, the information, analyses, and conclusions set forth are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. Please share your name and organization on the Zoom call so that the panelists and attendees can see who is participating. And if possible, please enable your camera and be prepared to ask questions to the panelists and discuss your feedback with fellow attendees. Remember to mute yourself when you are not speaking, and please take the evaluations after the event. Now that we have covered these guidelines, on the next slide, one more. I am excited to introduce Butler County Commissioner Kevin Boozle. Commissioner Boozle is a recognized leader in Western Pennsylvania and currently serves as the president of the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania. He serves on a variety of regional and local boards of directors and actively volunteers with the Harrisville Volunteer Fire Company. And you can read his full bio in the slides linked in the chat. Commissioner Boozle, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I think it's an honor to be here. And as I said earlier, I think that, this panel that you put together is going to be instrumental in helping communities continue to move forward. So with that being said, I do appreciate being here. My background is pretty eclectic. It almost looks as if I couldn't hold a job, but I love teaching and carpentry and housing and homelessness. And I worked in community counseling and worked with seriously mentally ill adults, which led me into the Redevelopment Authority and running homeless programs for a good while. But with all of that experience and learning how to write capital plans, I also learned how important it is to have a healthy county, a healthy community, and by that I mean how do community members interact? And so one of my roles as county commissioner, I am blessed to be the president of the County Commissioners Association. So I get to work with multiple counties on multiple different levels, including economic development. And I also serve with NACO, National Alliance for Counties, in a role of economic development. So I would tell you, some of the things that we work on a national level eventually trickle into our world in our county and state levels. And making sure that we're at the table and not on it is critical. And so, when I say that, I truly mean that. I've seen some leadership that have learned to be a little more complacent than they should be. And I've seen leadership that have been strikingly remarkable at telling their story. So, and that's all levels of leadership. That would be your municipality, your school boards, and communicating. And so, each one of you that are sitting on this call are really a liaison to each one of those circles of influence. And so, and that would include your state, your CDCs, your community development corporations, and so much more. So how do local leaders partner and attract employees and increase jobs and wages? I would tell you, you need to be the one telling your story. If you're not telling your story, someone's making it up. And if they're making it up, they may not have all the facts, nor are they knee deep in it as you would be. So what I'd like to do right now, if I may, is share a video. And this is one of the ways that we chose to tell the story for Butler County, which is a growing county. I don't know if I can do this. How do I do this? Oh, there it goes. Hopefully you can see my screen. It should come up soon. Can someone confirm?
We
Good.
can.
All right. And please watch the video. So hopefully that gave you an idea of what I'm talking about when you tell your story. And by all means, I think that everyone has a good story to tell, but as much as you're out there promoting and almost bragging, you have to take in every one of those aspects of your community, your health, your wealth, your hospitals, even down to your media. Do you have a local newspaper? Do you have a local radio? We have done assessments on things like livable communities, walkable communities. And I can tell you that that growth collaborative was formed once we became commissioners in 2016 when I first arrived. And we saw, before we came in as commissioners, by the way, we all three came in together. And we saw this lack of communication. We saw a story being told of Butler County that wasn't the story we wanted to tell because they weren't picking up on the good stuff. And it's really easy to ring the bell with the bad stuff. So you have to overpower those, in our opinion. So, the other part of this is under leadership and communication comes, the ability to collaborate. And so all of those groups that become part of the growth collaborative we're blessed with a community college and a university in Butler County. We have some major routes, tourism, agritourism. They are a big player. We're a class 4 county, so we don't have the ability to take some of those tourism dollars and put them into economic development. However, we work closely with our tourism to make sure that they're involved in economic development. We look at our comprehensive plan. We make sure that our plan is meeting up with what our municipalities are trying to do. We have monthly calls, Zoom calls, just like this, with every municipal leader invited to let us know what is going on in their community. What is your next generation? So right now, what we've done is we've turned over a lot of stones that haven't been turned over in quite a long time. And by approaching this from not just a county perspective, but from a municipal perspective, and even beyond that, beyond our county borders, we have a large water and sewage project. It was a failed system. It was a private system that was literally on the verge of being bankrupt. Near the Clarion and Venango and even up through Mercer County would be impacted by this one system that housed at least 700 to 800 jobs in that northern tier of Butler County, which is our very rural area. If that went away, those jobs had to go away because there's no system to maintain them. So they were at a point of literally not being able to buy a pallet of salt. The manager of that facility hadn't been paid in over a year. And so the county, the CDC, we made investment. And now it's up and running on its own. Those 700 to 800 jobs are secure. We're going beyond that. That's not enough. We need to make sure that it's resilient. And by resiliency, it means it's growing. And so we have those other county commissioners coming into the meetings. We have our state reps coming to our meetings, and we talk about how do we invest. We got H2O grant money. We have frameworks that we went after. I can talk about Butler County all day, and if you're not versed well enough in your own county or your own community, and you can't tell your story, and you can't do it in an elevator when you're in Harrisburg, literally, I'll give you an example of how this works. And Rick, I know you appreciate this because this is honest to God true story. I worked for 3 years to get $1.5 million road project done. We have in a very rural area, we have a place called Iron Mountain. You may have heard of it. It's an underground mine. It's a data system. There was a road. As a fireman, as you heard earlier, I'm a fireman. I was on a fire on this particular road called Harrisville Road. And the road was in such bad condition when I turned the tanker to go up a driveway to put a huge it was a huge field and forest fire. When I turned, the front right wheel sunk in the middle of the road and nearly broke the axle. And that's how bad this road was. And they have about 3,000 to 3,500 people working at this mine. And this is about 30 to 40% of their traffic taking this road. And this township literally has a budget of $300,000 total. The road's $1 million, $1.5 million just to fix this one stretch of road. There's no possible way that township would ever have the ability to do that. Through some of the state funds, and I went out there several times, I ran into, after 4 trips to Harrisburg, I ran into a gentleman in the cafeteria who laughed at me for being there for this $1 million, by the way. He was a state rep, and he said, in Butler, you're never going to see this money. because people don't vote the right way. This is the mentality. And so I had to break that down for them and show them the economic growth that we have and how it impacts the state. If you can't tell that story, that, by the way, that $1.1 million came to Butler County for that road. That road got done. But here's the problem. We also had to create an infrastructure bank in Butler County, second county in Pennsylvania, to do that. The reason we did it was for this township. This township of 300,000, they had to spend $1 million, finish the project, and then get it recouped. Well, they don't have $1 million. They don't have a line of equity that they can go out and get for $1 million. We as a county did it through our infrastructure bank. They did a borrowing at 0.5% from Butler County, and then they went out, finished the road. We got the money recovered back from the state. But if you're not making those connections, that would never happen. I can tell stories all day. I hope this was helpful to you. I think that what you're doing, that's how you meet the needs of rural, is being out there, communicating, making sure that you are at the table with them. Not, look, I don't go to a municipality and tell them what to do. I say, what's your plan? What do you need to do? I include that in my comprehensive plan. And I look at the state's plan and what they're planning on doing. But I also have to tell them GDP. I have to qualify my statements and my remarks. I have to show them that I have a $12 billion or $112 billion GDP on a single roadway that hasn't been touched in 50 years. Those stories have to be told because that's what resonates. So with that, I'm going to leave you with this last remark. I'm going to tell you that change doesn't happen. Change is made to happen. Change doesn't happen by itself. That's a John F. Kennedy quote. And if you're not there making the changes, no one else is going to do it for you. If you're not coordinating it, it will never happen. And if you're sitting back waiting for it to happen, it won't. It just won't. You have to be out in front. So Nathaniel, with that, I turn it back over to you. I appreciate the time. Hopefully this was helpful to anyone that was on the call. If it wasn't, turn it off, delete it from your recording. It'll be fine. Hopefully it was good.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Buzel. I greatly appreciate those thoughtful remarks, and they really help to set the context for how important things like capital can be for revitalization, things as simple as infrastructure and the ways that those build up into community and economic development more broadly. That's really helpful. And again, we really appreciate you being here. Thank you for taking the time. We'll now turn to our panel. It's a pleasure to introduce Rick Vilello, Deputy Secretary for Community Affairs and Development at the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. Many of you know Rick's commitment to revitalization because of his time serving as mayor of Lock Haven and in his current role at DCED. You can find his full biography and the slides linked in the chat. Rick, thank you so much for moderating this important panel conversation.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the Federal Reserve Bank and the Federal Community Action Assemblies for hosting this. It's a great opportunity, and you know, everybody talks about all of the negative ways that the pandemic has impacted us, but these type of events, these types of networking opportunities, and the communication that it's created through Zoom and Skype and Teams and all of that, you know, has changed the way we network in a positive way. You know, think of the participants today. How many of you would have traveled to Pennsylvania for a session like this on, you know, on community and economic development? It just wouldn't happen. But because of the pandemic and because of, you know, the changing the way we communicate and network, we have this opportunity to have this discussion today and learn from one another. You know, it's important. It's important to, you know, figure out best practices, to figure out, you know, when you see something that somebody's done and say, how did you do that? I want to figure out how to do that for my community. So, you know, it's a pleasure for me to be here. We have presentations from Kansas, Michigan, and New Hampshire. And Aubrey Abbott Patterson, President and CEO of Hutchinson Community Foundation, is going to talk to us about broadband in Kansas. All of us in Pennsylvania know about rural broadband issues. And it's something talked about and worked on for a long, long time. Hopefully some of these projects can get done. I'll turn it over to Aubrey for her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Aubrey Abbott Patterson with Hutchinson Community Foundation. I believe, are my slides coming up, Nathaniel?
Yes, they should be up momentarily.
Thank you. Hutchinson is a town of 40,000 people in the middle of South Central Kansas. And we are part of Reno County, which in total has 60,000 people. The community foundation I serve is called Hutchinson Community Foundation, the name of our town, but we serve the entire county in South Central Kansas. Let me tell you a little bit about Hutchinson while the slides are coming up. Hutchinson is a place that people in our state, and I'd like to think states around, know well. We have world-class attractions. We have a Smithsonian affiliated Air and Space Museum called the Cosmosphere. We have the only underground salt museum in this hemisphere. We have a top 25 golf course and Prairie Dunes, golf course and country club. We have a junior college that hosts the National Junior College Championships for basketball, volleyball, and track all across this country. The Kansas State Fair is held here in Hutchinson. So this is a community with a lot of pride in what we have to offer, and in the leadership we provided in the state, the partnerships we hold, and the place we've held as a regional center for a long time. But we're also currently in a place where our population is stagnant. It's the same today as it was 60 years ago. And we have a growing income divide as we've continued to lose industry, and notably as a retail center for the western part of the state, we've lost retail. And so what we see is an increase in service jobs. I'm trying to advance this slide, Nathaniel.
Apologies, I am trying to share control with you, but I can, if you tell me to advance, I'll
Sure.
move forward.
Just go ahead and advance that one. But what we're seeing is a growing divide in our income, and it's affecting the connections people have. It's affecting their health outcomes and their life expectancy. Here's the slide that shows you just our population. The industry is declining, service jobs are up. I suspect some of these things are familiar to all of you, especially as I watched Butler County's video, which was fantastic. It looked like a place that I know, a thriving place, but probably with challenges that you're all facing and tackling together. So there's some of the stats about our community. I just wanted you to see that and know a little bit about who we are. The next slide will show you that the community foundation I serve is 32 years old. And I see Mike Batchelor on this call, a leader in the community foundation field. I'm glad to see you, Mike. Maybe there are others from community foundations, but I'd like you to know that our community foundation has been doing this work for 30 years. In that time, we have accumulated $90 million in assets. I always say, more importantly, we've given away over 80 million. In this county of 60,000 people, it shows that it's a generous community, but also that it's a model that has worked here and for our people. For those of you who are community foundations and want to know, we are 43% endowed, but only 13% unrestricted funding. So our community foundation was built on donor advised funds, which have made a huge impact in our community. But what we know is the unrestricted funds are the ones we can use to really address the deep dawning challenges that our community faces. And so we have set about setting some pretty clear goals to build to $20 million in unrestricted funds by 2030. We're at about $9 million now in that toward that goal. But I think even more important than that goal is that we are doing the work of capturing this intergenerational transfer of wealth that's happening here in our county by asking people to leave 5% of their estates whatever's left at the end of their lifetimes to this community, the place that helped them build their businesses, accumulate their wealth, raise their families, would you leave 5%? And that ask is resonating with people. We've been asking for the last decade, and we have put between 70 and $80 million in planned gifts into a pipeline for people who said, sure, I would like to give back to this community. I'll use the community foundation in most cases as the steward of that gift. And then I'd like to help direct where that money goes. And we're becoming a lot more, well, I probably shouldn't use the words forceful or aggressive, but I just did, in asking people to give, but also helping them direct where that money goes, where it's going to have the most impact over time. We can go to the next slide, Nathaniel. So here's where what we get into is that our community needs more and more capital all the time, right? As things change here and our challenges grow. And the Community Foundation, 32 years into this, is always trying to get better and have more impact. And we're asking, how can we unlock even more capital for our community that needs it? We've been known as grant makers, and we still are, we always will be, but what more can we do? And ultimately, our answer to that question has been impact investing. We want to figure out how to use our assets differently than we have in the past. The market has been very good to us for 30 years, and hopefully it will continue to do so. But what if we were to take 5% of our investments out of well, actually, it's not going to come out of the stock market. It's come out of our bond pools, our fixed income portfolio. Take 5% of that and bring it back local. We could effectively double our impact because we're giving away 5% or more each year in grants. Now we could be investing 5% here into gap financing for entrepreneurs, economic development projects like what we're going to talk about today, rural broadband, but we've also made investments in housing, childcare, and downtown revitalization in a boutique hotel. We expect to keep doing more of this. We're at the very beginning of our journey. But impact investing for us has been what we've been striving to move toward and to teach ourselves how to do effectively. The next slide will show that our board has committed ultimately to a 5% carve out of our community's endowment. So it's not the full $90 million in our assets, it's the endowed dollars. But we're going to carve out 5% of that money and put it into a local investment pool. Then over the next year, we are going to invite donor advisors, those who have donor advised funds, and other non-endowed fund holders to invest in the pool with us. Our goal is to get to $3.5 million in that pool. And that is a 5% goal of what our assets were 2 years ago at 70 million. So I keep telling the board, 5% is 5% of whatever the total is today, right? So I know that 3.5 is not 5% of 90 million, but currently that's where we sit, is a goal of $3.5 million. And what a difference that would make for Reno County if we could get those assets deployed here locally in business startups that create jobs in 2s and 4s and 6s, revitalizing our downtown structures, providing broadband for people who need to work and study from home, places where they haven't had that access before. So we've been going down this path and doing a pretty good job of moving it along. And then we end up last March sitting at home. For me, it was in my house with my husband and my 3 kids, and the 2 of us adults trying to Zoom all day long with people in our community, and our kids trying to study on Zoom. And, you know, I live in town and I didn't have enough bandwidth to handle what my family wanted to do, let alone if one of them wanted to stream a Netflix show or play a video game, right? But what started happening pretty quickly was that we started hearing from the schools about how many students didn't have access to the internet at all, but certainly not to high-speed internet. And our local ISP provider, locally owned, has I'd say almost a mission for rural broadband. And they deploy fiber traditionally. It's what they do. And they started convening the superintendents and school counselors via Zoom from all of our 7 school districts in our county. And that conversation just quickly got everyone's attention for what our problem was. And we're saying we have at least 30% of our student population that didn't have any access at home to the internet. And while we honestly had not even considered broadband to be an area for us to invest in, that, you know, we had entrepreneurs and childcare and housing on our radar, broadband had never come up. I even had one board member tell me, this doesn't resonate. This is not how we want to make our first impact investment. People won't understand this. And I said, you're wrong. You're wrong right now. It's been an issue for a long time, but now in COVID, it's just been highlighted and exacerbated. And this is the time to get involved in this issue. We have a locally owned ISP. We can invest in them. That is how we are rooting wealth, is by investing in our people locally, and they're going to solve a big problem for lots of families across our county. And so that's what the path we went down, beginning, probably it was last April. I don't know, all those months run together now, but ultimately what we did, and we can go to the next slide for me, Nathaniel, is that here you can see that we made a loan to Idea Tech, is the name of the company, the locally owned internet service provider, for what became a $2.5 million expansion project. Ours was gap financing, and in the end, what it ended up being was the match required by our state, the state of Kansas. While we were going down this path of how can we quickly provide fixed wireless to rural people, our state came in with $60 million worth of funding for broadband, and Idea Tech applied and was awarded $2.5 million for our county and $13 million total for 3 counties. Our loan, coupled with the loan from 2 other partners, provided the matching money that Idea Tech had to have in order to get that grant from the state of Kansas. And what I want to demonstrate here is see those list of organizations at the top and how important those partnerships were. And they weren't partnerships we were developing it in March. We'd been developing these relationships, you know, for years. And so when March hit and we started talking about broadband, and then we started talking about investment, suddenly these things all made sense, how we could each play a part. And for us, it's funny that we made a loan, which is new to the Community Foundation. The Chamber made a grant, which is new to them. They don't do that very often. And then these partners from outside of our county, the $495,000 came from the Kansas Health Foundation in an investment pool of theirs. They're the largest philanthropy in Kansas. And their partner, Network Kansas, that provides the intermediary service that we needed to service a loan, because we're a community foundation and we don't want to service a loan. We want to make an investment, but we need partners who can do the hard work behind the scenes for us of taking care of the business. So all of these things came together, and we were able to not only provide the internet in rural Reno County to so many people, but also set Idea Tech, the ISP, up to be ready to apply for those funds from the state in 3 counties. And they said without these conversations that we'd been in, they would not have been as prepared or ready. And they were competing for those funds with other much larger providers. So we're proud of this. I forgot to mention that the United Way ultimately helped Idea Tech figure out how to reach underserved households, because they have that resident engagement piece. They know people, they have the relationships out in the county, and it all just worked together because, you know, it had to, with that money that came in there and had to be spent by December 30th. Everything had to flow from the state, federal to the state to us. And I'm proud of Reno County for coming together and figuring out how to make this work for us. And we attracted all of those assets from outside of our county too, which is really important to our mission and what we're trying to accomplish. For us, we're still working on understanding the barriers to connectivity assistance. I mean, that will continue to, you know, there are still a lot of households that have not taken the opportunity to add broadband infrastructure. The adoption of low-income households has been low, lower than we'd want, and so we need to continue to work on that. And we still have 10,000 households in South Central Kansas, not just in my county, but in South Central Kansas, that still need internet access. So we will keep working toward that. I forgot to show the next slide, Nathaniel, that shows ultimately what the impact was in Reno County. We have 515 more who have fiber, 2,400 households that now have that fixed high-speed wireless, and those towers are now in place. And in the midst of all of it, Ideatech was also able to put up 24 public Wi-Fi hotspots, which is where we started, of course, but it was pretty clear from the beginning that while those public Wi-Fi hotspots were nice, they were not sufficient for the long term. Nobody wants to leave their house at 7 o'clock at night to go to a parking lot to do homework, right? You want to sit in the comfort of your own home to do your homework and help your kids get done what they need for the next day's work. So, but we do have those public Wi-Fi hotspots. And you know, the beauty of impact investing is that we got all of that, and we're going to get a 3.5% return on our investment over the next 5 years. And that's what we're looking for. That our goal in that pool for our local investments is 3 to 4%. I think that competes with the fixed income portfolio, and so we get the financial return too. If you'll go to my last slide, Nathaniel, just to reiterate for us, you know, impact investing just continues to move us toward our mission. We are looking at long-term goals of a strong, diverse, and inclusive local economy, healthy, livable, and resilient community, and shared ownership that roots wealth locally. We think this impact investing and the broadband project in particular do all of those things. I talked about the benefits to the community plus the financial return. And we also believe that impact investing is giving donors an opportunity to invest in a new way, and that we will attract new donors to the Community Foundation, hopefully from within Reno County and outside of the county. We're also able to increase our public-private partnerships, attract more investment, and align our capital with our mission. So for us, impact investing has been a good tool, and the rural broadband project has made a huge difference in our county.
Thank you, Aubrey. Now, I mean, for all of us, things that you were talking about sounds like a lot of rural Pennsylvania, and some of the obstacles that we're trying to overcome. And our next presenter, Alyssa Sangali from Northern Michigan. You know, here at the Department of Community and Economic Development, we've been working closely with our partners in Michigan, with distressed communities and other initiatives through the Pew Foundation. And when I was thinking about today, a lot of the things in Northern Michigan are very similar to, you know, rural Pennsylvania. When you go to the Northwest and, you know, North Central and the Northern Tier of Pennsylvania could be the, you know, the northern area of Michigan. So I'll turn the presentation over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Richard. It's so nice to be with all of you today. I'm going to speak to you without slides. You know, Richard, in the beginning, you had mentioned how Zoom has enabled us to communicate and network in different ways. And for me, I will say one of the benefits of needing to work from home during COVID is that actually I spent part of the time not working from Michigan, but from my boyfriend's family cottage in rural Pennsylvania. So I spent a fair amount of COVID up near LaPorte in Sullivan County, and Pennsylvania is such a beautiful space or state. I have many good friends there in different parts of the state, and I definitely see the overlap between rural Pennsylvania and rural Michigan. So as he mentioned, my name is Alyssa Singali. I'm the president of Northern Initiatives. And Northern Initiatives is a CDFI, a community development finance institution. Just real quickly with a show of hands for those who have their cameras on, how many of you are familiar with CDFIs? Okay. So CDFIs are nonprofit financial institutions that are intermediary lenders that are lending based on mission. And Northern Initiatives was formed up in Marquette, Michigan, which is about as far north as you can go in the state, almost to Canada. It's right along Lake Superior. And the organization was formed back in 1994, really because Northern Michigan University, which is headquartered in that community, was concerned about the lack of jobs and opportunity to grow small businesses throughout Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Michigan's comprised of two peninsulas, and the Upper Peninsula has historically been an area with higher rates of poverty and declining population and joblessness. Back in the day, it had it was an area where there was a lot of mining, but much of that industry has since gone away. And so Northern Initiatives was in part formed in response to that, and trying to think about how to create an opportunity to create jobs and small businesses into the foreseeable future. At this point, our organization has expanded, and we are a lender in 77 counties around the state of Michigan, pretty much everywhere except the Metro Detroit area. So for about the first 20 years, we were only a rural lender in the Upper Peninsula. Then about 10 years ago, we started to lend in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, which is still really pretty rural, but has some tourist towns where the population doubles or triples in the summertime. And then just about 5 years ago, we expanded to do our first urban lending in the cities of Grand Rapids and Battle Creek and Muskegon. Since 1994, we've done $80 million in loans to small businesses. That's 1,600 loans, and those loans have helped to create or to retain over 6,000 jobs. Most of the businesses that we have helped finance have fewer than 9 employees. Many of them have just 2 or 3 employees. Since our founding, a third of the businesses that we've supported are startups. That was true even this last year during COVID. So we are helping people launch their dream out of their home or maybe in a storefront, and then helping to support them with capital as they continue to grow. About a third of our businesses are women-owned businesses. Now that we've moved into more urban areas, about 15% are owned by people of color. And over the course of our history, 70% of our loans are in low to moderate income census tracts. So they are areas with more persistent poverty. We are, as I mentioned, an intermediary lender. So we are a nonprofit. We borrow money from a variety of different entities and then lend that to small businesses. And we do all of the due diligence. And we also have a team of coaches that provide technical assistance to help businesses figure out money, marketing, management. Just because you want to own a bakery doesn't mean you know how to manage the actual business side. So we have coaches that help businesses that do that. Our capital, though, comes from the federal government. It comes from the state. It comes from community foundations. Some of it's CDBG money that we've worked in partnership with the state on. And each of those arrangements looks a little bit differently. But as Aubrey was talking about impact investing, we are frequently seen as a vehicle for impact investment. We have 6 different community foundations that have both granted us money to be able to hire a lender and some staff in their area to have boots on the ground, but they've also loaned us money. They've made program-related investments that then we use to re-lend to small businesses in the community. And this is a way that they're helping to create a more vibrant local economy and to create jobs, but to not have to deal with the whole process of doing due diligence and figuring out who in their community they should be financing or shouldn't be financing. We have a whole staff that is figuring that out. We are especially focused on areas where there is the most poverty. And these are places where historically banks are unable or unwilling to lend. And so we're filling that gap and helping these small businesses to launch, to grow, and then eventually to become able to enter the more mainstream financial system and to receive investment from banks and other entities. And so what that oftentimes looks like, maybe a restaurant owner or someone who wants to launch a restaurant on a main street. Restaurants are really hard to get bank financing for. About a third of our businesses that we support are restaurants or local breweries, and so we will make a loan to them. We can do things like offer working capital. We can help finance against their equipment, and then we'll stick with them through hard times. And that really has been the story for us of this last year and a half. I started in this role actually in March of last year, replacing their long-term CEO of 20 years. It was a very interesting time to jump into the community finance space and to figure out how to support a pretty vulnerable small business population. But we have an incredible team. And so last year, we spent a lot of the year really initially before there was any state or federal support, connecting with all of the businesses that we are funding, doing small express loans to them to help them have the cash on hand they needed to be able to pay their rent for their space, to be able to pay their employees. Then we worked with them in administering a lot of the federal and state programs that came out to support small businesses. We're oftentimes in Michigan, we have very strong partnerships at the state level. So some of those programs were administered through us, and we were helping deploy capital to small businesses. We had our team of coaches providing technical assistance and helping businesses rethink their business plan. And as the state opened and closed and different restrictions were put in place or lifted with COVID, we were working with our businesses to look at their business model and to figure out at what point, can you offer curbside delivery? How many staff do you need for that? Okay, if you're going to start to have people indoor, how many people do you need to hire? What does that look like now? How do you put a new point of sale system in place so that you can survive and pivot? How do you, just all sorts of things to be able to really help our small businesses, especially in our rural communities, survive the pandemic. And this year, our most recent body of work has been offering PPP loans to small businesses throughout the state. I'm sure you've heard of the PPP program. It's a federal program, but behind the scenes on that, a lot of small businesses were left behind, especially in rural places and businesses owned by people of color, because you have to have a strong banking relationship. That's the lender who's making those loans actually is using their own capital until that loan is forgiven and the federal government pays that back. And so we offered PPP loans throughout the state of Michigan to businesses who'd been left behind. The average loan size we did was $11,000, which is not of interest to most other financial institutions. It's a really small loan, but those went largely to small farms, to sole proprietors and small communities that were maybe like a consulting business where someone was working out of their home, or an event planner that was working out of their home, or maybe had a small office or small location on Main Street. And we were able to help those businesses survive and thrive. And I will leave my remarks at that.
Thanks, Alyssa. Your story is a story a lot of us have gone through and juggled and dealt with and learned. Everybody's doing the best they can. I can't imagine starting in March, new position, but you survived, and hopefully, it gets easier from here. Next, we'll move into New Hampshire, and Michael Swack will provide some comments, and then we'll go into questions and answers. So if everybody can hold their questions and answer, Michael, you're up next.
Okay. All right. Nathaniel, my slides up, or should I share my screen? What works best?
You should be able to advance with your
Okay.
keyboard arrows.
That sounds good. Okay. Thank you. And thank you for those presentations. Interesting to hear. My name is Michael Swack. I'm director of the Center for Impact Finance at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. We do training, research, and work on applied projects with CDFIs, philanthropies, banks, on developing new tools, models for investment. And what I want to talk about today is a case study really of a project called Vested for Growth, which is part of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, which is a CDFI, just like Alyssa talked about before, that she's a CDFI as well. We want to look at, I want to talk a little bit about a different approach to financing that we use, which is a type of equity financing. And we found that this was an important tool. Most CDFIs do loans, many public agencies do loans, but many times you run into businesses that just don't need a loan. They need investment, they need equity, and or equity type loan, money that they don't have to pay back right away. And that's very difficult for many institutions to do. This is something we've been doing for about 12 years now. So I'll briefly go over how it works and what our experience has been to date. One of our goals was not just to provide equity, but to look at the job side as well, to make sure that we are financing good jobs. One of the things that we found with many public agencies and CDFIs that were doing business financing is that they were concerned about the ability of reaching people who couldn't otherwise borrow. And they also were interested in jobs, but often didn't look at what types of jobs were they creating. Vested for Growth was very interested in that. We wanted to make sure we were providing good jobs with benefits, and we're helping business owners figure out how they could do that. What are the sorts of things they could do? So the first was we wanted to provide flexible financing. In this case, equity type financing. Public entities and private entities like CDFIs often don't like to do equity because they don't want to own a business. They don't want to be involved in owning a business or oversight that ownership requires. In some instances, they aren't able to do that. But we wanted to look for a type of financing that would really fill a gap. And as we talked to businesses in rural New Hampshire, what we found is, although there's a lot of equity capital, it's not for rural businesses in New Hampshire or rural businesses anywhere else for that matter, that the equity markets simply don't exist for most businesses. If you're not high tech, if you're not in biotechnology, it's really difficult to get equity type financing. And so we set out to figure out how we could do that. Essentially how it works is that we provide a couple types of financing, debt with royalty financing. Now, royalty financing involves a company providing, well, most of you are familiar with basic royalty financing, but in this case, we provide debt with royalty financing, which means we would get a percentage of the gross sales or net operating income as a way of repaying an investment. The other approach we use is pure royalty, and the way that worked essentially is that we would make an investment and get a percentage of revenue that would be paid monthly, and we could earn up to an aggregate, a multiplier of the original investment. So what this means is we actually had the ability to, if the business did well, make more money than you would make with a loan, but also we would take into account there may be instances when the business would not perform well and we might lose money. So the basic royalty agreement we used was one where we would usually limit the multiplier to 1.5 to 3 times the original investment over a specific period of time. What this does is it allows the business flexible financing and also allows it to pay in accordance with how well it's performing, and allows us to offset some of the risk that we take with the return that we could earn. And we found that a lot of companies were enthusiastic about this, in part because they thought they were going to perform well. And so they said, if we perform well, this is great. We get the equity type of financing we need, and we don't mind sharing some of the revenue, particularly since it's capped. It's not like we were going to have, 5 times the original investment and have it go on forever. It's limited in terms of the amount of time, so generally 3 to 5 years, and the amount that we would earn. Now, I should say this doesn't work for all businesses. This type of financing works with businesses that have high margins, that is high net profit. So, you look at different types of businesses that do that, and again, high margins means sort of net profit divided by revenue. But we found that there were a number of businesses that actually fit this category. And in New Hampshire, these were often older manufacturing businesses that had really strong markets, but for example, might need to buy new equipment to keep up with the demand, new equipment to in order to do more, take advantage of some of the technologies that were being developed. And so we found that there's actually pretty significant demand for this. We also wanted to look at how we could help these businesses in terms of creating quality jobs. And what we found was that many of the businesses, and these were often ones that employed fewer than 30 people, generally between 10 and 30 people, small manufacturing businesses that were, for many of these small communities, the core employers, was that they wanted to, but they didn't really know how. That is, a big example is we would say, well, have you ever considered profit sharing? And they would say, well, we would love to do it, but we don't even have an HR department. We don't know how to do this sort of stuff. Can you help us? So one of the things we did was create a CEO roundtable of the businesses that we invested in that would meet every several months to talk about what can we do around creating quality jobs for our employees. So what were some of the ways that we could look at quality jobs? And the program is called Vested for Growth. So the concept was to retain and create better jobs for employees, particularly ones who don't have a 4-year college degree. So some of the things that we would do with them, and none of this was required, it was all like, here, we'll help you think about, how can you do profit sharing? And what we found was when we introduced how profit sharing could be done, and that could be relatively simple, and that another CEO had done it in their community, it was like, oh yeah, we could do that. Just show us how to do it, and we'll do it. We also talked about how they could support professional growth of employees, how they could work with their communities. Simple things often we found, like scheduling, saying if you could schedule, several weeks in advance, this is a real advantage. A lot of employees would say, we don't like getting our schedule on Saturday for the next week because we can't plan. There were a lot of things in terms of minimizing hierarchy, using positive reinforcement, how they could talk about a job security, getting involved in the community. So this engaging employees was an important part of what we did, because the goal was not simply to support them financially, but to help them think about how they could engage employees and essentially become better employers. And again, we make a lot of suggestions. None of this was required. This wasn't a condition of getting the investment, but it was part of participating in the investment to improve the quality jobs. Since the program was started in 2009, we've provided, as you can see there, on this particular product, we also have more conventional lending product, but on this Vested for Growth equity type product, you can see the results there, about $5.67 million. You can see the jobs, the creation of the CEO work group, which has been a really terrific group where they can discuss ideas, share ideas on employee growth. And our returns have been approximately 8% on our portfolio of investments. So a pretty good return when you think about it, which does include, that's net of some of the losses that we've had as well. So that's the product we wanted to present today, an equity product that could be used as an alternative to PRIs by foundations, could be used by public agencies, a way of providing more flexible money, could be used by CDFIs as well. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, everybody. I'll start off with the first question, but anybody that has questions and want to do it on camera, you can raise your hand and we'll get to your question, or you can also put questions in the chat and I'll try to capture them. But I'll start off with a question for our panel. You know, in your day-to-day work or week-to-week or year-to-year work, and how important have relationships and networking been in your day-to-day work, and what type of outreach do you do to build those networks?
I'll start.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'll start by saying that most of the small businesses we finance, we find through word of mouth from other small businesses talking to small businesses in their community. And that's also true for the businesses that we're providing technical assistance for. And then in terms of relationships, we would not be able to do any of the work that we do if we did not have strong relationships at the federal level, the state level, and with local communities around the state, as well as our philanthropic partners. So those relationships are really essential.
Aubrey?
I could just say ditto to what Alyssa just said, because all those things are true for us too. Obviously, we couldn't do what we do at a community foundation without the relationships with donors, nonprofit partners, other partners around, stakeholders around the county and the region. But I also wanted to say that for the community foundation, we've made it very intentional to put relationships at the center of everything we do. And our theory of change is based on that the stronger our relationships are, the stronger our thinking will be, the better our outcomes will be. There's this virtuous cycle, and that we've got to focus on the relationships first. And so we're trying to connect people at every opportunity we can. We convene, we bring people together, we have the hard conversations to build the relationships over time so that it'll serve us well when we need it. And we saw that with COVID, that we had been doing this pretty intentional relationship building, not just for ourselves, but creating this community of coworkers in the nonprofit sector, and then starting to do that too with donors and other stakeholders. And when COVID hit, we had a group that could come together and gel pretty quickly around what we needed to do to support this community. So putting relationships at the center has made a huge difference in our work, and I think in our impact for sure.
Yeah, I would say also, you know, there are partners that we don't think of as traditional partners in community development that we really should. I mean, we have a project going now with 27 hospitals, actually all the hospitals in New Hampshire, on investing in the social determinants of health. And one of the things we've encouraged them to do is to invest in community development. What's interesting is when we convened the hospitals and the community development organizations, many of them had never met each other, even when they were in the same community. I know, Alyssa, you probably run into the same issues in talking about you know, investing. We've told the hospitals, those that have endowments, you should be investing in the community loan fund. Part of your money should be going there. We also tell the same thing to educational institutions. I gave a presentation a few years ago to the CFO of the university system of New Hampshire, and they've now invested $5 million in the community loan fund because it's a public responsibility to be doing that as well. So social determinants, I mean, we worked actually on a project in Vermont where we geocoded the most expensive, who were their most expensive patients. Not surprisingly, they were people with chronic diseases, drug problems and all that, had no place to live, would come into the emergency room, stay for a few days, end up with a bill of, you know, $80,000. The hospital would write it off. The University of Vermont hospital system actually found out, we ran the numbers for them, it was cheaper for them to donate money to build housing than to provide medical care. They bought several old motels, converted them to short-term housing, put a nursing station in them. They actually saved more money by donating essentially housing and had better medical outcomes than they did in the traditional way. So again, the idea of looking at who our partners is important, that we go beyond the traditional looking at partners as just banks and businesses to other entities as well.
I'm glad you mentioned hospitals, Michael. I left them off the list, but we have hospitals that are invested in us as well. And it's for the reasons that you mentioned. There are studies that show that communities with higher proportions of local ownership are better off by every health indicator. And so they invest in us to help create small businesses and the opportunity to build wealth in communities.
Building on the relationship with hospitals and, your networking, what's been the most surprising outcome from building those relationships? Have you any good stories about a surprising outcome when you just reached out to the community? All were expected?
I mean, that story about the Vermont hospital, again, the idea was they were just surprised that they could save money, actually save money and achieve better medical outcomes by working with the local community development organizations, the CDFI and local housing trust organization. And it was something that had just never occurred to them before. I mean, they were seen as two totally, we deal with health and you deal with housing, and, that's the way it is.
I would say from the Community Foundation perspective that we had a lot of fear about transitioning to impact investing. How would that affect our performance returns? But also, how would people perceive it? We invest over 300 funds for a very diverse group of people, families, corporations, nonprofits. How would they see this? Would they, we've always been invested in the ways they wanted to invest, which is the market and the bond portfolios and things people understand. Would they understand this? And I'll tell you that we knew from the beginning we'd have to have a lot of individual conversations. We have not received one pushback from an individual, a family, a corporation, a nonprofit board. No one has said, don't take 5% of my assets in that fund and put it back into this community. I mean, it requires a personal conversation because, of course, they ask the questions about risk and how are you going to choose and all those things. But when we can answer those questions and explain that this community foundation is uniquely positioned to take risk that others can't and do things that others can't, everybody says, okay, can I do more than 5%? And so those relationships and really knowing people and not being afraid to go out and talk to them about what we're doing and what this community needs has made a huge difference. And I'm not fearful anymore. We may come up against someone who doesn't love that we're investing 5% of their fund in something new locally, but now I'm not worried about it at all.
I think one of the surprises to me has been, so before I stepped into this role, I ran an organization that supported local businesses throughout Western Michigan and really worked at the intersection of helping local businesses figure out how to improve their impact on their employees, the environment, and the community. And then was trying to grow conversations about impact investing in the state of Michigan. And I think one of the surprises to me is how willing local owners are to want to create a positive impact in their communities. And a lot of what Michael was sharing really, really resonated with me and the experiences I had in that work. And also how long it takes to convince some longer standing institutions that they should consider investing in those more Main Street businesses, and that it's safe to do so, and that we all reap the rewards of that. I think this is a conversation that still feels newer to me than I would like it to feel. I would love for there to be mainstream adoption all over.
That works right into Nathaniel's question. How do you help new partners such as hospitals understand the connection between your missions?
We track a lot of data. So we track a lot of data and share that data about job creation and the impacts of businesses and things like that, and use that to make the case to all our partners.
I think also with hospitals in particular, I mean, hospitals are voracious collectors of data, much of it mandated, admittance data, when people are released, conditions, and so when we started working with hospital systems, one of the things they really liked was our ability to look at and analyze their data. And so, for example, this whole thing of like, who are we spending a lot of money on them? They were both in some ways surprised and not surprised that their most expensive patients were their poorest patients. It's not surprised when they actually looked at the numbers, but not something that had actually occurred to them or to make any connections, that their poorest patients were ones who didn't eat well and didn't have access or didn't to good food, didn't have access to a long-term affordable housing. And they sort of know that these affect health outcomes, but to actually see the numbers, to actually see what happens when someone with diabetes isn't on the street until they have to be brought to the hospital emergency room and kept for a few days while their blood sugar gets under control. What if you actually had access and that was part of the routine? So they sort of get it, but one of the things is show us the numbers. So, we showed them the numbers and they like that because they're about collecting data.
Michael, can I ask you a question on that topic?
Sure.
So is this publicly available data? Like, how did you get access to that data to build that business case?
Yeah, well, they had access, that is, which they shared with us confidentially. I mean, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which I can send to Nathaniel or share with people that actually details the numbers before and after. But hospitals collect data on admissions. They're required to. They collect discharge data, which says how long a person's been kept. This hospital, we had to sign non-disclosure agreements on some of it. Particularly because when you start identifying people by zip code, which we did, and there aren't that many, you can tell who they are. So there were, some of the issues around data collection that dealt with the privacy issues, but they had the data. I mean, collecting the data, knowing where people came from, and the admissions and discharge data and the costs associated with that. These are all data that they're mandated to collect.
Okay, thank you. I just didn't know if it was publicly available data that was where they kind of scrubbed the.
Some of it is. If you go to your state, all the states are required to collect this data through their health departments or whatever. So you can get hospital data from the state, and you can also, they report it, so that a lot of it is readily available. Yes.
We have a question in the chat that says it's essentially reviewing the SDH on loss leading encounters, right?
Yeah, SDH is social determinants of health. Yeah, I mean, they still spend a lot of money. Hospitals do. Notwithstanding Obamacare and the rest, there's still people who don't have health insurance. Hospitals have the community benefit requirement, which is sort of the bank equivalent of CRA. If you're a nonprofit, you're required to provide, it's usually money that's grant money that you get to give to different projects as part of a community benefit requirement. And so we're actually developing a fund in New Hampshire of hospitals that's a combination of investment and donation money, not just the hospitals, but others as well, to invest specifically in social determinants. And in many cases, like the one I cited, it's not going to be true in every case. You actually save money by prevention, right? Most people in the medical profession know that, notwithstanding the fact that there's always these arguments about we're going to do these elective procedures because that's what make the hospitals the most money. In many cases, that's true as well.
Then we have another question in the chat. How do you balance investing in organizations where you'll get a return and investing in organizations where there's more risk, but also opportunity for new innovation.
Well, that might refer to the vested for growth example. Really, it has to do with your sources of capital. I mean, the vested for growth relies on the fact that the CDFI has a particular amount of money that's set aside that's you match your sources and uses. So you don't use money that's short-term debt that you have to repay to investors to invest in equity type instruments. You use balance sheet capital, or you have an equity pool. Again, this is a place where program related investments from foundations or public money, where there's not a requirement for repayment, can go into a special fund to make equity investments where you can absorb a loss if that happens. And that's important. Again, you don't want to use short-term debt to make equity investments. You want to use permanent capital or equity type investment to make equity investments so that you can absorb that risk. There is no question that it's higher risk than most lending.
So this is an area where I think about, so each of the small businesses that we're investing in is coming to us because they are inherently more risky. Otherwise, they would often be going to a bank or a credit union or finding capital some other way. And so, that's the space that that's our mission, to invest in those enterprises. And so when I think about how we de-risk that, there are a few different things we do. One, I mentioned that we have a whole team of coaches on our staff who are providing technical assistance to small businesses. Part of that is to help them succeed and help their business grow and prosper. Part of that's also so that we have somebody there who's helping them survive, especially when things are challenging. And so that's one way we think about de-risking what we're doing. There are also some things that we do in partnership that are really important. So we, for example, have a partnership with the state of Michigan where they offer an 80% guarantee on all loans that we make with a specific pool of funds that we use. And so we can know that at that particular pool is from a bank. So at the end of the day, when we have to repay that bank, we know that there's an 80% guarantee from the state that if everything falls apart, at least that is there. Although we hope, hopefully things don't all fall apart, and we work to make sure they don't. We also use a number of federal programs to help de-risk those loans. So for example, we have capital from a community foundation that we were just using to make loans to small businesses. We owe that community foundation a 3% return on that. We're using that particular money to make loans that are part of other federal programs where there's a guarantee on that money as well, so that we are even more assured that we'll be able to manage that risk. And then the third partnership I would mention is that we do have foundations who will give us grants that we can hold in loan loss reserve to be able to manage risk as well on other investments.
Yeah, I apologize. I do have to leave early. I have another meeting. If there are other questions, I did leave my email contact in the chat. But thanks again for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Mike, in response to your question about CDFIs, Alyssa can probably answer it more technically, but I would say that in Kansas, when we started talking about impact investing, we wanted to use intermediaries so as not to have to recreate ourselves. And we're in what I would call a CDFI desert. There aren't CDFIs serving Kansas, and if there aren't very many. So it was a Google search for me just to see, and there were a couple, but they weren't operating at a very high function. So we had to look for other ways to do that. And so we found partners in our local banks and credit unions, and also in Network Kansas, which I mentioned earlier. But working with them to say, this goes back to the mission question too, making sure that banks and credit unions understand we're not trying to compete with their investing function. We want to be gap financing for deals they'd like to invest in and like to see happen, but have a gap. And once we could get that across to them, they started coming to us and saying, here's a deal that we think fits your mission. We're investing.
CDFI.gov.
we will provide the participation loan to the community foundation so that you don't, and we'll service the loan for you. Those are the types of partnerships we've developed. But now it's interesting, now that we have an impact investment pool, suddenly CDFIs from outside of our state are calling, and I believe the service areas are expanding. But we have found some workarounds that work for our community.
And we just put a link in the chat to a couple different CDFI locators. And I put a note in there too, but I'll just echo, CDFIs can be willing to expand into new geographies. We have certainly done that to serve more of Michigan, but we've done that in partnership with entities that have been able to grant us the money to hire staff to begin to build a portfolio so we can be more self-sustaining in a place, and then other entities that were willing to loan us the capital to lend in those places. And so it really takes those two things.
Other questions or comments from the group? Nathaniel, do you want to take the?
Yeah.
I was going to say, do you want
a few closing thoughts? If we could have each you and Alyssa and Aubrey say just a few closing remarks, and then we can transition to a break in the breakout groups.
Aubrey, do you want to give a few closing remarks first?
Sure. I'd say thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I'm learning how to talk about these things. I've learned a whole new area of operations for our community foundation, and also a whole new area of impact for our community. And so, Alyssa, I enjoyed listening to you talk about your work, because it teaches me some of how I want to frame these things and share them with others. So this is a great opportunity. Also, I wanted to give you a definition that we've been using of catalytic capital. I believe this came to us from Locus, which is a CDFI. The catalytic capital in our community foundation is disproportionate risk and possibly concessionary returns to generate positive impact and enable third-party investment that otherwise would not have been possible. And I really think that captures what we're trying to do here in Reno County, and understanding that we can take risk, we can be patient capital, and we can make some things happen that wouldn't have otherwise without us. I'm always open to questions if anybody'd like to reach out to me directly.
I also am just thankful for the opportunity to be able to share and to listen and to learn. Aubrey, I also learned from your remarks and from Mike's as well. And I wish we were in person. I think Mike and I may have met at a conference, but I don't know. I'll have to follow up with him. It's so good to be able to be with all of you. And I'm also happy to answer other questions. And thank you for all the work that you're doing to support rural Pennsylvanians.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Nathaniel for when we would come back into the small group breakout sessions.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rick, and also Alyssa and Aubrey, and to Mike. That was such a great and informative panel. I'm sure we're all eager to discuss. First, we're going to take a 5-minute break. During the break, you will be automatically assigned to a breakout group. The groups will not be recorded. We'll reconvene. We'll break out into the groups at 11:30, and we'll reconvene as a full group to discuss what was discussed in the breakouts at noon. So we'll be in the breakout groups for about a half hour, but ahead of that, we'll take a 5-minute break. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to furthering the discussion. Thanks so much. Welcome back. I hope that everyone enjoyed the breakouts. I'm looking forward to hearing more and looking through the notes, to learn about what you all talked about. But first, we're going to have a volunteer from each group, give a few-minute summary of what the group talked about. So if you could please unmute yourselves, and state your name and organization and give a few minute update on what your breakout room talked about. Who from room number 1 is going to give us our report out?
Hi, Nathaniel. I think I was in room 1, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so I'll just give a brief summary of some of our discussions. So there were many things that resonated with the participants in our group. Some of those things were discussions about health as a holistic ecosystem, specifically discussions and data about the social determinants of health. And so the importance of looking at health as that comprehensive concept. Additionally, we talked about the role of small nonprofit hospitals in the rural health model and some programming that's being done in the Northeast, as well as looking at like models in Philadelphia for some programming that's being implemented in the Northeast as well, and learning from some of their best practices. Another big point of conversation was discussion around barriers to implementing similar models in our state. So for example, there was some discussion about capacity of organizations. So maybe organizations with limited staff may not have the time to really dig into the data or do like backgrounding research to determine their like best practices based on their own research. So if some of that information was readily available to some smaller organizations, it would be helpful. So for example, maybe like if there was access to data that could be implemented in some way or disaggregated at like a more local level or regional level, that would be helpful. Learning from best practices, if there are best practices established as a resource somewhere that organizations can access or governments can access. Also assistance with like even knowing like the language or how to begin conversations with funding providers. So I think that that was kind of like a very broad overview of our discussion. Did I miss anything, Samantha or Alyssa?
I think we also just see our partners, particularly the folks from, we had Wayne County Community Foundation represented, and we also had the Center for Community Action represented. And one of the things that came up is just there's, you know, challenges with finding the right community foundation or CDFI in their area. So, you know, making sure that they can make those connections because they cover such a large area in different counties, but there might not be a CDFI dedicated to that entire county. So that was one of the things that, you know, thinking through where there are opportunities for better connections. Thank you, Christy.
That's excellent. And I was thinking during the panel conversation that the Pennsylvania model of rural health and, you know, implementing global budgets to allow for that kind of preventative investments in community health programs, you know, that's an important example, but that it's definitely different from some of the examples that they were talking about in terms of the work that Michael Swack has done in Vermont and in other areas with health systems. And you know, Christy, we hear very frequently that capacity is a real issue. And that kind of also gets to what Sam talked about. You know, we are also hear that, you know, where CDFIs have capacity to reach out a little bit. And it was interesting to hear Alyssa Singali on the panel say that, you know, where they have built their capacity is often where there is a funder that has said, you know, through this grant, we're going to help you to build out some staff or to reach into additional counties or regions in the state that they weren't previously working in. So that's a really you know, important topic or important issue or challenge as well. All right, well, thank you both. Now, who from group 2 has volunteered?
I'm gonna read my notes. Daniel.
Thanks,
So Allie facilitated, she had to jump off, I know, but her first question to our group was just what the key takeaways were and what were the main things people had on their mind. I think the biggest was questions about, it sounds like for instance, Holly from the Community Giving Foundation mentioned that it seems that the demand is really there and that they are moving forward, but there are a lot of questions about logistics and just kind of the nitty gritty, as we called it. So for example, let's see, so the paperwork, the legal aspect of it, that kind of thing, just a lot of questions about how to tackle that, how to do that. Molly from the Center Foundation mentioned the same thing, that they're moving in that direction. It seems like it's going that way, but how to approach that topic with their board, whether or not it's a good investment opportunity or should it be presented more as a community development opportunity, and then also how much work would be involved. Mike with the Erie Community Foundation pointed out that, or asked the question of how to build capacity would it be at the foundation level, or is there a lot of power in building partnerships at scale? Should we be looking more in that direction? Let's see. So again, the details I think are kind of on people's mind. They talked about like software and tracking. Are there options available in that way? And then we also discussed just sort of the capacity question, as you mentioned before, and how to build those partnerships, how to individual organizations then reach out to the CDFIs throughout the state. And there seem to be questions about just who to go to or where to go. Let's see, kind of finding the closest within proximity. Someone did point out that even if, so all of Pennsylvania is covered. So even if your local CDFI isn't able to help reaching out to another, you do have to do that work. Of course, that runs into the issue of the capacity on the organization's part to be able to do that. Allie did point out that the PA CDFI network is currently searching for a statewide director, so that might alleviate some of the extra work that could go into that. And she shared that job opportunity with our groups, or with our group, excuse me. Let's see, I do apologize if I'm missing a few things here. The next question Allie asked then was, are there models that could be applicable to communities then? And Mike again mentioned what they've used with the Erie Community Foundation is Arc Terrace. It's a hedge fund, and it's been driving opportunity into low income areas. So it's a good opportunity for outsourcing, but then bringing money still into the community. I think those were the main points, unless anyone else in my group wants to jump in with anything I missed.
And you reminded me, I need to thank our facilitators and note takers for being agile and kind of switching from the 5 groups that we were going to break out into to the 3 that we did. But you know, again, I hear things that kind of harken back to both the mission of this event and the work that we at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia do in terms of connecting folks with those nitty-gritty details or with those network building opportunities. We really think that having folks like the panelists on and Rick Valello, you know, and even, you know, all of our attendees here today, it's an important opportunity for folks to connect so that they can learn a little bit more about what does it really mean to get your board of directors to see impact investing as a viable option, or, you know, what are those legal details that you need to kind of think about when you're considering these new innovative funding models. So that's a really important point as well, and well taken. Thank you. So who from group 3 will be giving a report out?
Hi, Nathaniel. I will actually be reporting out for group 3. So a majority of our discussion sort of centered on the education aspect that seems to be kind of missing, and the importance of kind of getting the word out about these different organizations and opportunities that might exist. Specifically like facilitating educational processes for stakeholders, how to get more involved with this, and sort of where to start and where the resources are actually located to kind of build these best practices. and work with these organizations across rural communities. Specifically, we kind of got into a discussion about broadband access issues and different organizations that might be working to build these processes out. Chet Daniels made some really good comments around this and trying to sort of hear more about any initiatives or organizations that others in our group might have been aware of, specifically surrounding sort of the broadband and software development initiatives in rural Pennsylvania that might be applied to his home state. Additionally, some of the barriers that our group talked about to implementing some of these models, similar to what Christy and Samantha reported on, just capacity issues for smaller organizations, the time commitment that is sort of needed to build these opportunities. And additionally, some issues around, building trust in rural communities, how to best go about that and just really, work with communities, not just study communities, to really get that deeper engagement level. And that was a majority of our sort of discussion, with some really great resources that were shared by Group 3. So, Keith and Kyle, please feel free to jump in if I missed any big topics, or anyone else from Group 3.
I think those were the hitting points. Thank you very much, Olivia.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. That's, again, it really harkens back to some of the important points from the panel in terms of, Rick asked a question about, what do you do for outreach and engagement to the panelists, and how do you kind of build your networks? And I think a really important component of that is education, right? Helping potential partners like hospital systems or other economic development entities to understand how your missions overlap and how your impact can kind of be greater when working as an aggregate or as a whole, or working on coalitions. So that's really excellent. All right, well, thank you everyone for participating today. I really appreciate your time. We are ahead of schedule, but we're going to move into the optional networking lunch. For folks who are able to stay, we'll just break out into the same rooms where people are still on. But I'd love to share the floor if anybody has any last thoughts. I really appreciate everyone for being here, both thanks to our partners from the Center for Rural Pennsylvania and from Penn State's Center for Economic and Community Development. The partnership on this series has been really excellent. It's helped us to really shine a light on these issues, and also help some folks to make connections to build their work out. But if anyone has any closing thoughts before we switch into the optional networking lunch, I'd be glad to share the floor. Thanks, Rick. We appreciate you. Thanks for being here. Oh, and I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug. Our next assembly is scheduled for July 15th on equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems, tourism, and seasonality. Registration is open. Please register for that.